Every morning for 40 years, the baker of Hollowmere carried a single warm loaf of bread across the old stone bridge before the first church bell ever rang. He wrapped it in fresh linen, placed it upon a weathered wooden bench beneath the great willow tree, and then, without looking back even once, returned to his bakery. By sunrise, the loaf was always gone. No one had ever seen who took it. No one had ever followed the baker through the morning mist. And no one in Hollowmere had ever asked why. It wasn't because the villagers lacked curiosity. Quite the opposite. Hollowmere was the sort of place where people noticed everything. Mrs. Pembroke knew exactly which swallows returned to the chapel roof each spring. Old Mr. Fletcher could tell who had walked along the riverside simply by the pattern of muddy footprints left upon the bridge. Even the children knew when Mrs. Green had baked blackberry tarts instead of apple pies, long before they reached her cottage, because the sweet fragrance drifted through the village lanes on the afternoon breeze. Nothing escaped the notice of Hollowmere, except, perhaps, the one mystery everyone quietly agreed to leave alone. Visitors often found it puzzling. A traveler arriving before dawn might catch sight of the baker crossing the bridge with careful, measured steps, carrying bread that smelled of warm wheat, fresh butter, and a touch of honey. The traveler might hide behind the low stone wall, wondering who would come to collect it. But by the following morning, someone from the village would gently smile and say, "Around here, we don't wait to see who takes the loaf. Some kindnesses lose their magic the moment they become spectacles." The traveler would rarely ask another question, for there was something about Hollowmere that encouraged quiet acceptance. Some traditions did not exist to be explained. They existed to be kept. And perhaps that was why the promise had survived for 40 years. Edmund Marchbanks had lived his whole life within sound of the Hollowmere bell tower, and by the time he was 40, the villagers could not recall a version of the bakery that did not have him standing behind its counter before dawn. His bakery sat on Lavender Lane, wedged between the bookseller's shop and the lane that curved gently down toward Hollowmere Green, its window fogged each morning with the warmth of the ovens inside. The copper bell above the door had been worn smooth by decades of hands long before Edmund's own had ever touched it, and the flour that dusted his forearms each morning seemed less like mess and more like a second skin he had worn for so long he no longer noticed it at all. His mornings followed a rhythm so steady that villagers set their own days by it. He rose while the mist still clung low over the old apiary, kneaded his dough in the blue hour before sunrise, and had his ovens glowing gold long before the church bells rang for the first service. Children pressed their noses to the bakery glass on their way to school, watching the dough rise beneath his patient hands. Elderly women lingered at his window on cold mornings, warming themselves against the glass, though most would only admit they had stopped to smell the bread, never to watch him work. Edmund was, by every account, a gentle man. He remembered which of his customers preferred their crusts soft and which liked them nearly burnt. He remembered birthdays without being told, and he always seemed to know without asking. When a family had fallen on a difficult week and needed something warm on their table more than they needed coin in his till, Mrs. Pembroke often said that Edmund had inherited his father's hands and his mother's heart, and that the combination had made him, without any effort of his own, one of the quiet pillars that held Hollowmere together. And yet there was a stillness in him that even his oldest friends had learned not to press. Old Mr. Fletcher, who had known Edmund since they were boys chasing geese along the riverbank, said once that Edmund had always carried a private weather about him, fair most days, but with a corner of sky that never quite cleared. It was there in the pause before he answered certain questions. It was there in the way his eyes moved toward the bridge each morning before he turned back toward his ovens. No one in the village begrudged him this. In Hollowmere, a person's quiet corners were treated the way one treated a locked garden gate. You did not rattle it, you simply let the ivy grow undisturbed. The villagers had their own theories about the loaf beneath the willow tree, though none had ever dared voice them to Edmund directly. Some believed it was a debt of gratitude, repaid every morning without fail. Others believed it was penance for something long since forgiven by everyone but himself. The oldest among them, who remembered Edmund's mother and the gentle sorrow that had followed her in her final years, suspected the truth ran deeper than either guess, though they, too, kept their suspicions to themselves. If evenings spent wandering through Hollowmere's lanes and lingering at its bakery windows have become part of your own bedtime routine, you are always welcome to subscribe to the Murmured Garden whenever you need a quiet place to rest. Edmund's days, aside from the loaf and the willow tree, were built from small and steady kindnesses. He kept a chair by the hearth at the back of the bakery for anyone who needed to sit a while without explaining why. He kept a tin of shortbread for the schoolteacher, Miss Alcott, who came by every Thursday to mark her students' papers where the ovens kept the chill away. He kept, too, a drawer beneath the counter that no one but himself had ever opened, and inside it, wrapped in the same square of fresh linen he used each morning, sat a small, worn recipe book that had not belonged to him at all, but to someone the village had mostly stopped asking about. The recipe book had belonged to Edmund's younger sister, Clara, and though 30 years had passed since anyone in Hollowmere had spoken her name aloud in his presence, the older villagers had not forgotten her. Clara Marchbanks had been, by every account, a bright and restless girl, quicker with her hands than her brother and quicker still with her tongue, though never unkindly so. She had baked beside Edmund from the time she could reach the counter, and it was said that she had a gift for knowing exactly what a loaf needed before it needed it, the way some people know a storm is coming before the first cloud appears. Their mother had often said that between the two of them, Clara had inherited the imagination and Edmund had inherited the patience, and that Hollowmere was fortunate to have both qualities living beneath the same roof. What had happened to Clara, none of the younger villagers could say with any certainty, though the oldest among them remembered enough to hold their tongues out of kindness rather than ignorance. She had left Hollowmere the autumn she turned 19, and the details of her leaving had settled, over the years, into the sort of soft-edged silence that villages sometimes wrap around a wound too old to reopen and too tender to forget. Mrs. Pembroke, who had been a girl herself at the time, remembered only that there had been a disagreement, the particulars of which had long since blurred, and that Clara had gone without the customary goodbyes exchanged between neighbors who expect to see one another again. Whether she had written since, whether she was even still living, was a question no one in Hollowmere had ever heard Edmund answer, and so, in time, no one had thought it kind to keep asking. What remained of Clara, aside from the recipe book in the drawer, was scattered gently throughout Edmund's bakery in ways only the closest observer might notice. The particular way he folded dough before setting it to rise had been her method, not their father's. The blackberry preserve he sold each summer followed a recipe she had scrawled in the margins of that same worn book, her handwriting looping and hurried, as though she had always been thinking 3 thoughts ahead of the one she was writing down. Even the bell above the door, an ordinary copper thing worn smooth by years of hands, had once been polished bright by Clara on a Sunday afternoon simply because, as she had told their mother, a door ought to announce good news properly. Edmund's oldest friendship in the village belonged to Mr. Fletcher, who kept the small cottage nearest Hollowmere Bridge and had known the Marchbanks family since before either man could remember learning to walk. The two of them had grown up chasing geese along the riverbank, stealing warm rolls from Edmund's father's ovens when they thought no one was watching, and later, as young men, sitting together on the bridge in companionable silence more evenings than either could count. It was Mr. Fletcher, and only Mr. Fletcher, who had ever dared ask Edmund directly about the loaf beneath the willow tree. Some 15 years into the ritual, when curiosity had finally outweighed his usual restraint, Edmund had only smiled, the particular smile he reserved for questions he did not intend to answer, and said that some promises were kept better in silence than in explanation. Mr. Fletcher had never asked again, though he had, in his own quiet way, made certain never to walk that stretch of the bridge himself before sunrise, as though offering Edmund the privacy he seemed to need without ever naming why. Miss Alcott, the village schoolteacher, occupied a gentler corner of Edmund's week. She arrived at the bakery every Thursday afternoon with a satchel of her students' papers, and Edmund kept the chair nearest the hearth free for her without needing to be asked, along with a tin of shortbread that seemed to refill itself by magic, though in truth he simply remembered to bake extra. Their friendship was built from small exchanges rather than long conversations. A comment on the weather, a question about a particularly troublesome student, an occasional shared silence while she marked her papers and he tended his ovens. It was Miss Alcott who had once observed, gently and only to Mrs. Pembroke, that Edmund seemed to save his truest warmth not for the customers who praised his bread most loudly, but for the quiet ones, the ones who came in needing something more than flour and butter could really provide. The recurring motif that threaded through all of these relationships, though no one in Hollowmere would have called it that, was the linen cloth. Edmund used a fresh square each morning to wrap the loaf beneath the willow tree, and the older women of the village had noticed over the years that he was particular about the fabric in a way he was not particular about much else. It was always the same soft, undyed linen, always folded the same way, the corners tucked with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial. Mrs. Pembroke, who had once helped his mother with the household linens in years long past, recognized the pattern of the weave as belonging to a bolt of cloth the family had kept aside for something she had never learned the purpose of, tucked at the back of a cupboard that Edmund's mother had guarded rather closely. Small joys filled the spaces between these quieter currents. Edmund kept a particular fondness for the first frost of the season, which he said made the ovens feel more generous by comparison, and for the sound of rain against the bakery windows, which he claimed improved the flavor of a loaf, though he could never explain precisely how. He was known to hum an old, wordless tune while kneading dough, one that Mrs. Pembroke swore she had heard Clara humming decades before, though whether Edmund had learned it from his sister or she from him, no one could say for certain any longer. He kept bees in a small corner behind the bakery, more out of habit than industry, tending them with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything else, and it was widely agreed in the village that Edmund's honey, drizzled over a warm slice of bread on a cold morning, was among the finest comforts Hollowmere had to offer. Beyond the bakery and its immediate neighbors, Hollowmere unfolded in the same unhurried pattern it always had, each corner of the village holding its own small rhythm within the larger one. Down past Hollowmere Green, where the grass stayed worn soft by generations of gathered feet, stood the village inn, its windows glowing amber each evening, its innkeeper known for a stew that seemed to taste faintly of whatever comfort a traveler most needed that particular night. Beyond the inn, the lane curved out toward the orchard, its old apple trees planted, it was said, by the very first families to settle Hollowmere, their branches heavy each autumn with fruit the whole village shared freely, no one troubling to keep careful count of whose basket held the most. Further along, past a bend thick with wild honeysuckle, sat Foxglove Cottage, its garden spilling color over a low fence in a way that seemed almost defiant of the tidier gardens elsewhere in the village, and its occupant, an elderly herbalist named Mrs. Quill, supplied half of Hollowmere with the dried teas and gentle remedies that eased its coughs and its sleepless nights alike. Edmund traded her bread for chamomile and dried lavender more Thursdays than not, and it was her particular blend, steeped slow beside the fire, that Clara would later learn to favor above all others, carrying the habit with her all the way to the coast and back again, 40 years later, without ever quite forgetting where she had first learned to love it. Edmund's nearest neighbor on Lavender Lane was Aldous Wren, the bookseller, whose shop shared a wall with the bakery so thin that each man had grown accustomed, over the years, to the small sounds of the other's trade drifting through the plaster. The soft thud of dough being turned on one side, the quiet rustle of pages being sorted on the other. Aldous kept an orange tabby named Marmalade who had, since kittenhood, treated the shared wall as a suggestion rather than a boundary, slipping through a gap behind the woodpile to spend his mornings curled in the warmest corner of the bakery, close by the ovens, before wandering home again in the afternoon smelling faintly of bread. Edmund had long since given up trying to discourage this arrangement, and in truth he had grown fond of the cat's company, keeping a small dish near the hearth that Marmalade considered entirely his own. The friendship between the two shopkeepers had been built, like most friendships in Hollowmere, from small and steady exchanges rather than any single dramatic beginning. Further along Lavender Lane, past the bend where the lane opened onto Hollowmere Green, old Widow Ashworth kept a garden that villagers still called simply the Widow's Garden, though her husband had been gone some 20 years by the time this particular autumn arrived. She grew foxglove and delphinium along its low stone border, and it was said that she had once been dear friends with Edmund's own mother, the two women trading cuttings and comfort in equal measure through the years when both had known what it was to keep a house steady around an absence. Edmund brought her bread each week without being asked, setting it just inside her gate rather than knocking, for the widow preferred her mornings undisturbed, and it was one of the quiet certainties of the village that whatever Edmund set outside a door in Hollowmere, it was always precisely the right kindness for the person receiving it, offered exactly as gently as it was needed. It was on one such frost-bright morning, with the bees still slow and sleepy in their hive and the recipe book resting undisturbed in its drawer, that the first small change arrived in Hollowmere, though Edmund would not recognize it as such until several days had quietly passed. The change arrived, as most changes did in Hollowmere, without any great fanfare. It came in the form of a letter, delivered by the postmaster's boy on a Tuesday morning when the frost had only just begun to soften on the bakery window. Edmund did not receive many letters. His correspondence, what little there was, came mostly from a mill or two villages over who supplied his flour, and the boy's habit was simply to leave such things on the counter beside the till without a word. But this letter was different enough that even the boy, who noticed little beyond the coins he was owed for his trouble, paused a moment before setting it down. The paper was fine, though yellowed with age at the edges, and the hand that had addressed it was looping and hurried, as though the writer had always been thinking 3 thoughts ahead of the one being written down. Edmund did not open it at once. He set it beside the till, dusted his hands of flour, and served the morning's first customers as though nothing at all had changed, though Mrs. Pembroke, who happened to be among them, would later say she noticed the particular stillness that came over him when his eyes first fell upon the handwriting. It was not until the bakery had emptied for the mid-morning lull, the ovens settled into their steady, familiar heat, that Edmund untied the string and unfolded the letter, and read it through once and then a second time more slowly than the first. He did not speak of its contents to anyone that day. He finished his baking as he always did, wrapped the loaf for the willow tree that evening with the same careful attention he had given it for 40 years, and closed the bakery at the usual hour. But Mr. Fletcher, walking past on his way home from the riverbank, noticed that the lamp in the back room burned later than it ever had, and that when he passed again near midnight, unable to sleep himself, the light was, quite unusually, still glowing behind the curtains. The following morning the villagers noticed small things, the sort of small things that only a place like Hollowmere, so attentive to its own rhythms, would ever think to remark upon. Edmund's bread, for the first time in living memory, came out of the oven a shade darker than usual, as though his attention had wandered somewhere in the kneading. He forgot entirely to set aside the tin of shortbread for Miss Alcott's Thursday visit, and had to apologize and hurry to bake a fresh batch while she waited, laughing gently, by the hearth. And when old Mr. Fletcher stopped by that afternoon, as he often did, to share a companionable silence over a cup of tea, he found Edmund standing at the back window, looking out toward the willow tree and the bridge beyond it, in the particular way a man looks at something he is trying and failing to see clearly from a great distance. Mr. Fletcher did not ask what troubled his oldest friend. He simply sat, as he always did, and let the silence hold whatever needed holding. But before he left that evening, Edmund said something he had never said in all the years of their friendship. He said that he thought, perhaps, an old debt was coming due, one he had believed settled long before either of them had grown old enough to understand what settling truly meant. Mr. Fletcher asked nothing further. He only nodded, the way one nods at a friend crossing a bridge alone, and told him that Hollowmere had a way of carrying its people gently, whatever waited on the other side. It was 2 days later that the drawer beneath the counter was found open. Edmund had not left it so. He was, in all things, a careful and orderly man, and the drawer that held Clara's recipe book had remained closed and undisturbed for 30 years, opened only by his own hand and only rarely, on evenings when the quiet grew heavier than usual. But on that particular morning, the drawer stood ajar, the linen wrapping disturbed, and tucked between 2 pages of the worn recipe book, where no letter had ever rested before, sat a single pressed lavender flower, its color faded nearly to silver, its stem still delicately intact after what must have been many years of careful keeping. Edmund stood before the open drawer for a long while before he touched anything at all. He recognized the flower at once, though he could not have said, if asked, precisely why its presence unsettled him so deeply. It was the sort of small object that meant nothing to anyone but the person who had once pressed it, and yet its return, appearing exactly where it had never been before, felt to Edmund like the turning of a key in a lock he had believed sealed shut long ago. He lifted it carefully, as though it might crumble at the lightest touch, and sat with it a long while in the chair by the hearth that he usually kept free for others, the recipe book open upon his knee, the bakery quiet around him, the bread in the ovens forgotten for the first time in 40 years. He did not yet understand what the flower meant, or who had placed it there, or why the letter and the flower had arrived within the same week after decades of undisturbed silence. But some quiet part of him, the part that had watched the bridge every morning for 40 years without ever admitting why, understood that the answer, whatever it was no longer content to wait beneath the willow tree. The pressed flower remained on Edmund's knee for a long while that evening, and though he eventually returned it to its place between the pages of Clara's recipe book, he did not close the drawer again as he once had. It stayed open through the following days, a small crack of light where there had once been only careful darkness, and the villagers who noticed such things began to sense, without quite knowing how to name it, that something in Hollowmere had shifted gently, the way the light shifts in late autumn before anyone quite admits that summer has ended. Mrs. Pembroke was the first to ask, though she asked it sideways, the way villagers often did when a question felt too large to hold directly. She came into the bakery on an ordinary Wednesday, ostensibly for a loaf of the seeded bread she favored, and lingered near the counter longer than her purchase required, her eyes drifting more than once toward the drawer that had, for 30 years, remained closed to everyone but Edmund himself. She did not ask what he had found there. She asked, instead, whether the frost had been hard on his bees, and whether he thought the willow by the bridge had grown taller this year than last, and Edmund, understanding the question beneath the question, answered gently that some things grew taller only once you finally allowed yourself to look at them properly. Mrs. Pembroke nodded, satisfied with an answer that told her everything and nothing at once, and left with her bread still warm beneath her arm. It was Mr. Fletcher, in the end, who learned the most, though even he learned it slowly, in the unhurried way that Hollowmere seemed to prefer for all its important truths. He came by one evening as the bakery was closing, the last of the day's warmth still lingering in the ovens, and found Edmund sitting once more in the chair by the hearth, the recipe book open on his knee, the lavender flower resting now atop its pages rather than pressed between them. Edmund did not wait to be asked. He told his oldest friend, in a voice quieter than Mr. Fletcher had heard from him in many years, that the letter had come from a woman in a coastal town some days' journey from Hollowmere, a woman who had written on behalf of someone too frail to hold a pen steady any longer, someone who wished, before the end of her days, to know whether a promise made in her youth had ever truly been kept. Mr. Fletcher asked, gently, what promise this might be, and Edmund was quiet a long while before he answered. He said that Clara had not left Hollowmere out of anger, as the village had long assumed, nor out of any disagreement so simple as a quarrel between siblings grown apart. She had left, he said, because she had fallen in love with a young man from beyond the village, a wheelwright's apprentice passing through one autumn on his way to the coast, and their mother, fearing the uncertainty of a life spent following a man with no settled trade, had forbidden the match entirely. Clara had gone anyway, as bright and restless girls sometimes do when a door is closed too firmly against them, and in her leaving, she had asked one thing of her brother, the only thing she had ever truly asked of him in all their years together, that he keep a loaf of bread waiting beneath the willow tree each morning, in case she ever found her way home again and needed, without having to ask aloud, to know she was still welcome. He had kept that promise for 40 years, though the last word he had received from Clara herself had arrived only in the earliest of those years, a short note assuring him she was well, followed by a silence that had stretched longer than either of them, perhaps, had ever intended. He had told himself over the decades that the loaf was simply his way of honoring an old promise to a sister he loved, and that its disappearance each morning, taken by whichever traveler or villager happened to need it most, was itself a kind of quiet grace, even if it was never Clara's hand that had taken it. But the letter now resting beside the recipe book told a different, gentler truth, that Clara had settled eventually in that coastal town, had lived a full life there with the wheelwright she had loved, and had, in her final years, asked a friend to write on her behalf, wishing only to know, before she could no longer wonder at all, whether her brother had ever forgiven her leaving, and whether Hollowmere still remembered her kindly. Edmund read the letter through a third time that evening, after Mr. Fletcher had gone home along the darkened lane, and found that the ache he had carried so quietly for 40 years did not vanish so much as settle, the way a long-held breath settles once it is finally released. He understood now why the loaf had never once been collected by the sister he had waited for. Clara had never been near enough to Hollowmere to take it, not in all the years he had wrapped it in linen and set it beneath the willow tree at dawn. And yet, he found, this understanding brought him no bitterness at all, only a strange and tender relief, the sense of a door quietly opening after decades of believing it sealed. He wrote his answer the following morning, before the ovens had even warmed, seated at the small writing desk his mother had once used for her own correspondence, tucked into the corner of the room above the bakery. He wrote slowly, choosing his words the way he chose the ingredients for his finest loaves, with care and patience rather than haste. He told Clara that Hollowmere had never once stopped remembering her kindly, that her recipe book still guided his hands each morning, that the blackberry preserve still followed her scrawled instructions in the margins, and that the loaf beneath the willow tree had never been a burden but a comfort, a small daily act of hope he had never once regretted, whatever its true purpose had turned out to be. He told her, too, the thing he suspected she most needed to hear, that there had never been anything to forgive, and that the door to Hollowmere and to his own heart had remained open for her the whole of these 40 years, whether she had known it or not. The village learned of Clara's story slowly, in the gentle way that important truths traveled through Hollowmere, passed first from Mr. Fletcher to Mrs. Pembroke over a shared pot of tea, and from her to the schoolteacher, Miss Alcott, who received it not as gossip but as something closer to a blessing, a piece of the village's own history finally settling into its proper place. No one spoke of it loudly. There was no gathering in the square, no dramatic unveiling of the truth behind the loaf beneath the willow tree. Instead, the villagers simply began, one by one, to understand Edmund a little more fully than they had before, and to feel, in some small unspoken way, that a wound the whole village had carried alongside him for 40 years had finally begun, quietly, to close. Old Mr. Fletcher, walking home from the bakery that evening, paused a while upon Hollowmere Bridge, looking down at the willow tree where the loaf had rested each dawn for as long as he could remember. He thought of all the mornings he had deliberately avoided that stretch of path before sunrise, offering his oldest friend a privacy he had never fully understood the reason for, and found himself smiling gently into the gathering dusk, grateful that some kindnesses, even unexplained ones, were worth keeping simply because they were kind. The mist was beginning to rise from the river below, soft and low, the way it always did as evening settled over Hollowmere, and somewhere behind him, in the warm glow of the bakery window, Edmund's lamp burned steady and unhurried, a light that had, for 40 years, never once gone dark. Weeks passed before another letter arrived, and this one came not from the friend who had written on Clara's behalf, but from Clara herself, her hand grown unsteady with age but unmistakably the same looping, hurried script that still marked the margins of her recipe book. She wrote of the coastal town where she had settled, of the wheelwright she had loved and eventually married, of the small garden she had kept there filled with lavender she had grown from seeds carried, she confessed, all the way from Hollowmere in the lining of her traveling coat. She wrote, too, of the years she had spent wondering whether her leaving had broken something in her brother that could never be mended, and how the fear of that answer had kept her from writing sooner than she should have. Edmund read her letter seated by the hearth. The fire burned low and golden, the bakery quiet around him in the particular stillness that settled each evening once the last customer had gone and the ovens had cooled to their nighttime rest. He found himself smiling at her descriptions of the coastal garden, at the small, familiar details that told him Clara had never truly stopped carrying Hollowmere with her, whatever distance she had placed between herself and its lanes. He wrote back that very night, and in the weeks that followed, a steady correspondence grew between them, letters crossing the distance between village and coast with a regularity that neither of them had known in 40 years, each one a small thread drawing the old, quiet wound gently closed. The villagers noticed, in time, that Edmund's bread had returned to its usual golden color, and that his humming, that same old wordless tune Mrs. Pembroke swore had once been Clara's, had grown a little more frequent, drifting through the bakery on mornings when the frost lay heaviest on the windows. He still set a loaf beneath the willow tree each dawn, wrapped in the same soft linen, though he no longer watched the bridge with the same searching stillness Mr. Fletcher had noticed for so many years. The ritual had not ended. It had simply settled into something gentler, an offering made from habit and hope rather than unanswered longing, and the village, sensing this shift without needing it explained, seemed to breathe a little easier for it. Autumn deepened into winter, the way it always did in Hollowmere, the mist over the old apiary turning to frost, the bees settling into the quiet sleep of the coldest months. The lanes softened first by fallen leaves and then by the season's first gentle snow. Edmund kept his correspondence with Clara through those darkening months, her letters arriving now with a warmth that matched the ovens themselves, filled with small stories of her garden, her husband's failing but peaceful health, and memories of their shared childhood that she said she had, until now, been almost afraid to let herself remember too fondly. She wrote, in one such letter, that she hoped one day, when the weather allowed and her own strength permitted, she might see Hollowmere again, if only to stand once more beside the willow tree where her brother had kept his promise for so many patient years. Winter settled fully over Hollowmere by the time Clara's next letter arrived, one that carried a different weight than those before it, gentler in tone but heavier somehow, the way the last snowfall of a long season sometimes feels different from all the ones that came before. She wrote that her husband had passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the small comforts of the home they had built together, and that in the quiet weeks since, she had found herself thinking of Hollowmere more than she had allowed herself in many years. She wrote that grief, she was discovering, had a way of loosening the grip of old fears, and that she found herself wanting, more than anything, to see the willow tree again before the winter fully passed. Edmund read this letter twice by the fire, and then a third time the following morning, seated at his mother's old writing desk with the frost still thick upon the window glass. He wrote back at once, his hand steadier than it had been in the early days of their renewed correspondence, telling her that Hollowmere's door and his own had never once closed to her, and that whenever she felt ready to make the journey, however long it took her to feel strong enough, she would find the bakery exactly as she had left it, the ovens warm, the recipe book waiting, the loaf beneath the willow tree set out each morning as it always had been. He told her, too, that Mr. Fletcher still remembered her fondly, that Mrs. Pembroke still spoke of her kindly, and that the village she had left as a restless girl of 19 had never once stopped holding a place for her, whatever distance or silence had come between. He did not tell the village of this particular letter right away, wanting to hold the small, private hope of it a while longer before sharing it, the way one sometimes holds a warm cup of tea a moment before drinking, simply to feel its comfort a little longer. But Mrs. Pembroke, calling by one gray afternoon for her usual loaf, noticed something different in the set of his shoulders, a lightness that had not been there even in the months since the first letter had arrived, and she asked, in her sideways manner, whether the frost had been kind to his bees that week. Edmund, understanding as always the question beneath the question, told her simply that he thought perhaps a very old friend might be coming home before long, and Mrs. Pembroke, satisfied entirely by this answer, smiled and said that Hollowmere had always been good at keeping its doors open for exactly such homecomings. It was during those first weeks of renewed correspondence, before Edmund had told even Mr. Fletcher the fullness of what the letters contained, that he found himself walking one evening toward the clockmaker's cottage at the far end of the lane, drawn by no particular purpose beyond a restlessness he could not quite settle by kneading dough alone. Silas Hartley, who had kept Hollowmere's clocks running true for longer than anyone in the village could properly recall, was known for a patience that rivaled even Edmund's own, and the two men had shared, over the years, an easy if infrequent friendship built mostly around comfortable silence and the occasional cup of tea taken among the quiet ticking of a dozen clocks in various states of repair. Edmund did not tell Silas the particulars that evening, only that he found himself thinking, more than usual, about time, about how much of it could pass before a thing once broken finally found its way toward mending. Silas, turning a small brass gear over in his weathered fingers, said that he had spent the whole of his working life among machines built entirely to measure time's passing, and yet the one lesson they had never quite taught him was any trick for hurrying it along. Some mechanisms, he said, simply required their full and proper winding before they would run true again, and a wise clockmaker learned early to trust the mechanism rather than force the hands. Edmund carried this thought home with him through the darkened lane, past the bakery window still glowing faintly gold, and found that it settled something in him he had not known needed settling, a quiet permission to let his own mended things take whatever time they required. The weeks that followed passed in the unhurried rhythm of a Hollowmere winter, the days short and softly lit, the evenings long and warmed by hearth fires in every cottage along Elderbrook Lane. Edmund continued his mornings much as he always had, the bread rising in the blue hour before dawn, the ovens glowing gold against the darkness, the loaf wrapped in linen and carried across the bridge to rest beneath the willow tree. But there was a new quality to these mornings now, a quiet anticipation folded gently into the familiar routine, the sense of a story that had waited 40 patient years finally drawing, gently and without any drama at all, toward the close it had always deserved. The letter announcing Clara's arrival came on a morning in early spring, when the last of the frost had only just begun to loosen its grip on Hollowmere, and the first tender shoots of green were pushing up through the softened earth along the riverbank. She wrote that she had found the strength for the journey at last, that a kindly neighbor from her coastal town had offered to accompany her, and that she hoped, if the roads remained passable, to arrive within the fortnight. Edmund read the letter standing at his counter, the morning's first loaves still warm behind him, and felt something in his chest loosen so completely that he had to sit a moment in the chair by the hearth before he trusted himself to speak to the next customer who came through the door. He told Mr. Fletcher first, finding him as he always did upon the bridge in the late afternoon, watching the river run high with the spring melt. His oldest friend received the news with the quiet steadiness Edmund had come to rely upon for 40 years, though his eyes, Edmund noticed, grew brighter than usual, and he said only that it was about time Hollowmere had something worth truly celebrating. Word moved gently through the village after that, from Mr. Fletcher to Mrs. Pembroke, from Mrs. Pembroke to Miss Alcott, and onward through the lanes in the unhurried way important news always seemed to travel in Hollowmere, until nearly everyone knew, in the soft and private way villagers know such things, that Clara Marchbanks was coming home. No one made a great show of it. There was no banner strung across the square, no gathering arranged to mark the occasion, for Hollowmere understood, as it always had, that some homecomings were too tender for spectacle. Instead, small kindnesses began to appear in quiet, uncoordinated ways. Mrs. Pembroke aired out the small guest room above her own cottage, in case Clara's strength required rest before continuing on to the bakery. Miss Alcott gathered a handful of her students to sweep the path along Lavender Lane, telling them only that an old friend of the village was returning after a long time away, and Mr. Fletcher, without saying a word to anyone, spent an evening trimming the low branches of the willow tree, so that whoever came to stand beneath it would find it exactly as lovely as it had always been. The evening before Clara's arrival, Edmund found he could not settle to sleep, and so he rose quietly in the dark hours and walked alone down to the bridge, the village silent around him, the stars still visible in a sky not yet touched by the coming dawn. He stood a long while beside the willow tree, resting one hand against its familiar bark much as his sister would, unknowingly, come to do the following afternoon, and found himself thinking not of the 40 years of waiting that had led to this particular night, but of a single ordinary morning from his boyhood, Clara beside him at their father's counter, both of them too small yet to reach the highest shelf, laughing at some joke neither of them could later have named. He wondered whether she still remembered that morning at all, or whether the years and the distance had worn it as smooth and faint as the pattern on Mrs. Pembroke's old linen. He thought, too, of his mother, gone now some 15 years, and of the particular sorrow she had carried in her final seasons, a sorrow he had always privately believed was born less of Clara's leaving and more of her own fear that she had been the one to close the door too firmly. He had never found the words, while she lived, to tell her that some doors, once closed, could still be found again, gently, by anyone patient enough to keep a light burning nearby. He said the words now instead to the quiet water beneath the bridge, the mist just beginning to rise pale around his boots, and found that the saying of them, even to no one but the river, brought him a measure of peace he had not expected. By the time the first gray light touched the sky, Edmund had returned to the bakery and set his ovens burning, kneading the morning's dough with hands that felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely unburdened. Mrs. Pembroke, arriving early to help air the guest room above her own cottage, found him humming that same old wordless tune, louder and steadier than she had heard it in years, and she said nothing of it, only smiled to herself as she continued on her way, understanding, as Hollowmere always seemed to understand its own, that some mornings needed no explanation at all, only the quiet grace of being allowed to unfold exactly as they were meant to. Clara arrived on a mild afternoon in the second week of spring, the mist having lifted early that day to reveal a sky washed pale and clean after several days of gentle rain. She came by cart along the road from the coast, her companion helping her down carefully at the edge of the village, and she stood a long moment at the top of Lavender Lane before taking a single step further, looking down its familiar curve toward the bakery window, fogged as it always was with the warmth of the ovens inside. Edmund, who had been watching for her from behind that very glass since mid-morning, set down the loaf he had been shaping and walked out to meet her, his hands still dusted with flour, exactly as they had been dusted with flour on the morning she had left, 40 years before. They did not speak at first. Clara, her hair silvered now, her frame smaller and more careful than the restless girl who had once hurried through these same lanes, simply reached for her brother's hand, and Edmund, feeling the years fall away in that single touch, found he did not need words either. They walked together slowly down Lavender Lane, past the bookseller's shop and the lane curving toward Hollowmere Green, until they reached the bridge and beyond it, the willow tree standing exactly where it always had, its branches newly trimmed and gently swaying in the soft spring air. Clara stood beneath the willow a long while, one hand resting against its familiar bark, her eyes moving slowly over the bridge, the river running bright beneath it, and the bakery window glowing warm in the distance behind them. She said, at last, that she had pictured this place so many times over the years, in so many quiet hours when homesickness had crept up on her unexpectedly, that she had half feared the real Hollowmere might disappoint the one she had carried so carefully in her memory. But it did not disappoint her at all, she said, for it was exactly as she remembered, only softer somehow, gentler, the way a place always seems once you have stopped fearing your own return to it. Edmund told her, standing there beside her in the fading afternoon light, of the 40 years of loaves left beneath that very tree, wrapped each morning in the same soft linen, taken always by someone in the village who needed them, though never, as they both now understood, by the sister he had truly meant them for. Clara wept a little at this, though gently, the way one weeps at a kindness too large to hold without some small overflow, and she said that she could not imagine a truer proof of love than 4 decades of quiet, unrewarded hope, offered every single morning without complaint or explanation. Edmund only shook his head and said that it had never once felt like a burden, that the giving itself had become its own reward long before he understood its full purpose, and that Hollowmere, in receiving what he could not give directly to her, had taught him something about love he did not think he could have learned any other way. They walked back to the bakery as the evening settled in soft and unhurried around them, the first lamps of the village beginning to glow gold in cottage windows along Elderbrook Lane, the church bells sounding their evening call somewhere behind the mist rising once more from the river. Mrs. Pembroke was waiting near the bakery door with a pot of tea already steeping, and Mr. Fletcher arrived not long after, standing a moment in the doorway before crossing to embrace Clara as though no 40 years had passed at all. Miss Alcott came by soon after with a small posy of early spring flowers, gathered, she said, from her own garden along the way, and the small bakery on Lavender Lane filled that evening with a warmth that had nothing at all to do with the ovens still glowing steady in the back room. They sat together long into the evening, the fire crackling low in the hearth, the recipe book brought down from its drawer and opened between them on the table, its pages worn soft with 40 years of quiet handling. Clara traced her own handwriting in the margins with something like wonder, remarking that she had forgotten entirely which recipes had been hers and which their mother's, and Edmund, watching her fingers move gently over the page, felt the last small corner of the private whether he had carried for so long finally clear completely, like sky after a long and patient rain. Clara stayed in Hollowmere through that spring and into the summer that followed, taking a small room above Mrs. Pembroke's cottage at first, though it was not long before she found herself spending most of her waking hours in the bakery on Lavender Lane, her hands remembering, almost without instruction, the old rhythms of kneading and shaping that she had not practiced in 40 years. The villagers grew accustomed to seeing her there each morning, working quietly alongside her brother in the blue hour before dawn, and it was generally agreed, though never said aloud in her hearing, that the bread had taken on a particular sweetness in those months that even Edmund's skilled hands had never quite achieved alone. The loaf beneath the willow tree continued each morning, as it always had, though now it was often Clara's hands that wrapped it in linen, her steps that carried it across the bridge in the soft gray light before sunrise. She said, more than once, that she understood now why her brother had never once resented the ritual, for there was a particular peace in the act itself, in the walking and the placing and the quiet trust of walking away without waiting to see what became of the gift. The traveler who might once have hidden behind the low stone wall to watch would have found, that summer, 2 figures rather than one crossing the bridge some mornings, though the loaf itself remained, as it always had, simply and quietly given. Summer settled over Hollowmere in its familiar unhurried way, the lavender fields along the lane turning their soft violet color, the bees in Edmund's small hive behind the bakery humming steady and industrious in the warm afternoons, the roses along the old stone walls climbing a little higher with each passing week. Evenings grew long and golden, the villagers gathering more often on Hollowmere Green to sit together as the light faded slowly toward dusk, and it became a common sight that summer to see Edmund and Clara among them, sharing a bench with Mr. Fletcher and Mrs. Pembroke, their conversation unhurried, their laughter, when it came, soft and easy in a way it had not been for either of them in many years. As autumn approached once more, the recipe book found a new home, no longer tucked away in the drawer beneath the counter but resting openly upon a shelf behind the till, where anyone might see it, its pages worn soft with hues both old and new. Clara added her own small notes to its margins that season, recipes remembered from her years at the coast, a particular way of steeping tea with dried lavender that she said had comforted her through many long evenings of missing home. Edmund found, watching her write, that the sight of her handwriting once more filling those pages felt less like the closing of an old wound and more like the simple continuation of something that had never truly stopped, only paused, the way a favorite tune might rest a moment between verses before returning, familiar and unchanged, to carry the melody forward. One particular Thursday that autumn stayed longer in the village's memory than most, though nothing especially remarkable happened within it, only the sort of gentle abundance that Hollowmere seemed to save for evenings it wished its people to remember fondly. Rain had fallen steadily since mid-afternoon, tapping soft and unhurried against the bakery windows, and by the time Miss Alcott arrived, her shawl damp at the shoulders and her satchel tucked carefully beneath her arm to keep the papers dry, the fire in the hearth had already been built up high, throwing warm light across the worn floorboards and the shelf where the recipe book rested. Mrs. Pembroke came soon after, shaking the rain from her coat at the door, and Aldous Wren followed not long behind her, Marmalade slipping in ahead of him through the gap by the woodpile before anyone had properly opened the door at all. settling immediately into his usual corner near the ovens as though he had never left it. Clara set out cups for everyone without being asked. The tea steeped with a few leaves of dried lavender in the manner she had learned at the coast, and Edmund brought out a loaf still warm enough to steam faintly when it was cut, along with a small dish of his honey, dark and thick with the last of the season's harvest from the hive behind the bakery. Conversation moved easily that evening, the way it always did among people who had long since stopped needing to fill every silence. Mrs. Pembroke spoke of the swallows that had left the chapel roof earlier than usual that year, a sign, she was certain, of an early winter, though Aldous gently disputed this, citing some old almanac he kept behind his counter that predicted nothing of the sort. Miss Alcott, setting her papers aside rather sooner than she had intended, told a small story of one of her youngest students, a girl who had insisted, quite seriously, that the willow tree by the bridge must be magic, since bread simply could not disappear on its own otherwise, and the room filled with soft, delighted laughter at the innocent nearness of the child's guess to a truth she could not possibly have known. Clara, drawn out by the warmth of the evening, told a story of her own from the coastal town, of a winter storm so fierce it had torn the roof from the wheelwright's shed, and how the whole street had turned out afterward not to mourn the damage but to rebuild it together within a single afternoon, passing tools and tea between households with the same unhurried generosity she said she had always secretly hoped might exist somewhere beyond Hollowmere, and had been quietly relieved to find it. Did Edmund listened to this with the particular stillness he reserved for moments he wished to keep exactly as they were, watching the firelight move across the faces of the people gathered in his kitchen, and thought, not for the first time that year, that a room this full of quiet warmth was itself a kind of answer to every question the loaf beneath the willow tree had ever raised. The rain continued long into the evening, softening eventually into the gentle patter that Edmund always said improved the flavor of a loaf, though he still could not explain precisely how, and one by one his guests rose to gather their coats and shawls, lingering a while longer at the door before finally stepping out into the wet, lamplit lane. Aldous left last, Marmalade trotting ahead of him back toward the gap by the woodpile, and he paused a moment at the threshold to say, quietly, that he could not recall the last time the bakery had felt quite so full, and that he suspected, whatever mysteries the village still kept to itself, this particular room had found exactly the ending it deserved. Edmund only smiled, the same smile he had once reserved for questions he did not intend to answer, though this time, for the first time in many years, there was nothing at all left unanswered behind it. Autumn deepened once more over Hollowmere, the mist gathering low each morning over the old apiary, the leaves along Elderbrook Lane turning slowly from green to amber to the deep, quiet gold that seemed to belong only to that particular season in that particular village. The bakery settled into a rhythm gentler than any it had known in 40 years, Edmund and Clara moving through their mornings together with the easy, wordless coordination of two people who had once shared a childhood and had, against all quiet fears, been given the rare grace of sharing an old age as well. The loaf beneath the willow tree continued each dawn, wrapped now sometimes by one pair of hands and sometimes by the other, though it no longer carried the same private ache it once had, only the simple, steady warmth of a promise that had finally been allowed to rest. Mr. Fletcher took to joining them some evenings, the three of them sitting by the hearth long after the last customer had gone. The fire burned low in gold, the recipe book resting open on the table between them more often than closed. He would tell Clara stories of the years she had missed, small things mostly, the particular winter the river had frozen thick enough to walk across, the year the church bells had cracked and taken half a season to repair, the quiet triumphs and small sorrows of a village that had gone on living fully even in her absence. Clara listened to these stories with the same unhurried attention she brought to her baking now, nodding softly, occasionally laughing at some remembered mischief from her girlhood that Mr. Fletcher recalled more clearly than she did herself. Mrs. Pembroke and Miss Alcott became frequent visitors as well, drawn as much by the warmth of the ovens as by the quiet pleasure of watching an old wound in the village's own history finally settle into something whole. It became known, without anyone quite deciding to make it so, that Thursday evenings belonged to the bakery on Lavender Lane. A small gathering of neighbors and friends who came for tea and bread and the particular comfort of sitting together as the light faded outside the fogged glass windows. Miss Alcott brought her marking some weeks, as she always had, though she found herself finishing less of it than usual, too content simply to listen to Clara's stories of the coastal garden she had left behind, the lavender she had grown from Hollowmere seeds carried so carefully all those years before. Winter came again, softer this time than the one that had carried Clara's husband from her. The first snow falling gentle and unhurried over the village rooftops, settling in careful drifts along the low stone walls and the bare branches of the willow tree by the bridge. Edmund and Clara kept their mornings much as they always had, the ovens glowing gold against the early darkness, the bread rising in the warm hush before dawn, the loaf wrapped and carried across the frost-bright bridge to rest in its familiar place. The bees slept quiet in their hive behind the bakery, and the bakery itself seemed, that winter, to hold a warmth that reached further than its own four walls, drawing villagers in from the cold not merely for bread but for the particular comfort of a place that had, at last, made its peace with its own long history. It was on one such evening, deep in the stillness of midwinter, that Clara asked her brother whether he ever thought of ending the ritual now, since the promise it had once been meant to keep had been so fully and gently fulfilled. Edmund considered this a long while, watching the fire settle lower in the hearth, before he answered that he thought he would keep it all the same, not out of old grief any longer, but out of a habit that had become, over 40 years, something closer to a prayer than a burden. The loaf, he said, had never truly been for Clara alone, whatever its original purpose. It had become, somewhere in all those quiet mornings, a small offering to whoever in Hollowmere might need it most, a way of keeping something warm and given freely moving gently through the village, year after year, regardless of who carried it across the bridge or who took it up on the other side. Clara found she agreed, and so the ritual continued, softened now into something neither of them thought of as waiting, only as giving, plain and simple and unhurried. The villagers, sensing this shift as they had sensed every other quiet change in Edmund's long history, began to speak of the loaf beneath the willow tree not as a mystery any longer but as one of Hollowmere's own gentle traditions, spoken of fondly to visitors passing through, who were told, in the same unhurried way travelers had always been told, that some kindnesses in Hollowmere existed simply to be kept, not explained, and that this was reason enough for anyone who loved the village to let them continue exactly as they were. Spring returned once more, as it always did, the frost loosening its hold on the lanes, the first green shoots pressing up along the riverbank, the willow tree by the bridge beginning to bud with the soft, hopeful green that seemed, every year, like a small promise renewed. Clara took to sitting beneath it some mornings after the loaf had been placed, simply watching the mist lift slowly off the water, feeling, she said, closer to her own girlhood in those quiet minutes than she had felt in 40 years spent trying not to think of home too often. Edmund would join her sometimes, the two of them sitting together in comfortable silence, the bakery waiting warm and patient behind them, the village stirring gently awake around the bridge as the church bells began their soft morning call. The years that followed passed in Hollowmere the way years always seemed to pass there, gently, unhurried, marked more by the turning of seasons than by any single dramatic event. Edmund and Clara grew older together in the bakery that had raised them both, their hands slower now but no less certain, their mornings a little later perhaps, their afternoons spent more often by the hearth than at the counter, though the ovens never once went cold, and the loaf beneath the willow tree never once failed to appear at dawn. Mr. Fletcher remained their steadiest companion through all of it, joining them by the fire most evenings until the last winter of his own long life, when Edmund and Clara sat with him in turn, the way old friends do, offering the same quiet company he had offered them for so many decades. Winter arrived again the year Mr. Fletcher passed, softer than either Edmund or Clara had expected grief to allow, the first snow falling in slow, unhurried drifts over the rooftops of Hollowmere as though the village itself meant to wrap the whole of it gently in white. They sat with him often in his final weeks, in the small cottage nearest the bridge where he had lived the whole of his long life, and it was Clara who thought to bring the recipe book with her one evening, reading aloud from its worn margins the small notes and remembered stories scrawled there over the decades, so that Mr. Fletcher might hear, once more, the sound of a kitchen he had spent so much of his life sitting beside. He listened with his eyes closed, a faint smile settling over his features, and said, in a voice grown thin but still unmistakably his own, that he had always thought the finest thing about Hollowmere was that nothing truly kind was ever allowed to be forgotten there, only set aside for a while, the way bread rests before it rises. The village mourned him gently, as it mourned all its own, with small kindnesses rather than grand gestures. Mrs. Pembroke kept fresh flowers on the bridge where he had so often stood watching the river, and Miss Alcott gathered her former students, grown now themselves into parents and shopkeepers and quiet keepers of their own small corners of the village, to share their memories of the old man who had known everyone's comings and goings before they knew them themselves. Edmund found that he missed his oldest friend most in the particular hour just before dawn, when he had grown so used over so many decades to the comfortable knowledge that Mr. Fletcher's lamp would soon glow warm in the cottage window as he rose to walk the same lanes they had walked together as boys. But grief in Hollowmere, as Clara had once written to her brother from the coast, had a way of loosening rather than tightening its grip with time, and the following spring brought with it the same soft renewal it always did. The willow tree budded green once more along the bridge, the mist lifted each morning off water running high with the melt of winter snow, and the Thursday gatherings continued at the bakery hearth, quieter now with one chair often left empty, though never so quiet that laughter didn't return to fill the room in time. Miss Alcott took to occupying that chair some evenings, and it became, without anyone deciding it should, a sort of unspoken honor among the village's oldest friends to sit a while where Mr. Fletcher once had, carrying forward in some small way the steady warmth he had brought to that hearth for so many years. Summer came golden and full that year, the lavender fields along the lane blooming thicker than anyone in the village could remember, the bees in Edmund's hive humming so industriously that Clara joked they seemed determined to make up for whatever quiet grief still lingered among the humans who tended them. The roses along the old stone walls climbed higher still, the church bells rang their familiar call over lanes softened by long afternoons of sunlight, and the villagers gathered often on Hollowmere Green as evening settled gold and unhurried over the rooftops, sharing bread from the bakery and stories of a village that had, once again, folded its grief gently into the ongoing rhythm of its days. It became a tradition, in those years, for the village to gather at the old chapel each midsummer evening, a modest service followed by a shared supper laid out on long tables set across Hollowmere Green, and Edmund and Clara rarely missed it, walking down together in the long golden light with a basket of bread between them that the villagers had come to expect as surely as they expected the swallows each spring. The chapel bells rang a little differently on those evenings, Mrs. Pembroke always insisted, warmer somehow, though no one could ever explain what precisely made a bell sound warm rather than simply loud, and the old wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of Hollowmere's quieter Sundays, seemed to hold the summer light a while longer than the rest of the village around them. It was at one such midsummer gathering that Aldous Wren, grown properly old himself by then, remarked to Edmund over the supper tables that he had begun to notice something he had never quite put into words before, that Hollowmere seemed to measure a good life not by the grandness of its events but by the steadiness of its returns, the swallows to the chapel roof, the lavender to the fields each summer, the bread to the willow tree each dawn, and that perhaps this was the whole of what any of them might hope to leave behind, not some singular remarkable deed, but simply the quiet, reliable fact of having shown up, morning after morning, for the people and places that had come to depend on them. Edmund thought of this often in the years that followed, turning the words over the way he once turned dough, finding in them a comfort that seemed to grow only richer with time. Clara took to keeping cuttings from Widow Ashworth's garden in a small vase upon the bakery counter each summer, a habit she had begun the year the old widow herself passed peacefully in her sleep, tended in her final months by half the village in the same unhurried, uncoordinated way Hollowmere always seemed to manage its kindnesses. The foxglove and delphinium bloomed each year after that in a smaller garden Clara kept behind the bakery, close by the bees, and it became, in time, one more small thread woven quietly into the village's long memory, one more proof that nothing tended with care in Hollowmere was ever entirely lost, only passed gently onward into someone else's keeping. Each autumn brought the harvest at the orchard, a tradition older than anyone in the village could properly trace, and Edmund and Clara rarely missed it, walking down together with baskets to help gather what the old apple trees offered that year. The orchard's keeper by then was a quiet, capable woman named Wilhelmina Byrne, who had tended those same trees since girlhood and knew each one the way Edmund knew his own ovens, by feel and memory rather than by any written record. She kept a standing invitation open to the whole village each harvest, and it was there, among the low branches heavy with fruit, that Clara first taught a small gathering of village children the particular fold of dough that had once been her own girlhood invention, kneeling in the orchard grass with flour-dusted hands as patient as her brothers had ever been. Wilhelmina, watching this one golden afternoon, remarked to Edmund that she had always thought Hollowmere's truest harvest was never really the apples at all, but the slow, steady handing down of small skills and smaller kindnesses from one pair of hands to the next, a crop that never failed regardless of the season's weather. Edmund thought of the recipe book waiting on its shelf back at the bakery, its pages filling now with a third generation's handwriting alongside Clara's and his mother's, and found he agreed entirely, though he said only that he supposed some harvests simply took longer than others to properly ripen. The apples gathered each year found their way into pies at the village inn, preserves in Foxglove Cottage's kitchen, and a particular tart Edmund baked each October using a recipe Clara had brought back from the coast, its crust brushed with honey from the hive behind the bakery. The scent of it filled Lavender Lane for the better part of a week each autumn, drawing villagers to the bakery window not merely for bread but for the specific, anticipated comfort of a season arriving exactly as it always had, one more small proof that Hollowmere's oldest rhythms, however quietly kept, were in no danger of ever being forgotten. The seasons continued to turn in this way for years afterward, each one carrying its own small measure of sorrow and its own steady measure of comfort, the way seasons always do in a place that has learned, over generations, how to hold both at once without losing its footing. Edmund's hands grew slower with each passing winter, his hair silvering fully to match his sister's, though his mornings never once wavered from their familiar rhythm. The dough rising in the blue hour before dawn, the ovens glowing gold against the darkness, the loaf wrapped in soft linen and carried, some mornings by him and some by Clara, across the bridge to rest beneath the willow tree exactly as it always had. Clara took to keeping her own small notebook in those later years, separate from the family recipe book, filled with small observations of village life that she said she wanted remembered properly, the particular blue of the mist over the old apiary in early autumn, the sound the bakery bell made on frosty mornings when the cold made the metal ring a shade higher than usual, the way Miss Alcott always paused at the doorway before entering, as though giving the warmth inside a moment to properly reach her. She said these small things mattered as much as any of the larger history of the village, perhaps more, since they were the details that made a place feel truly lived in rather than merely remembered. It was some years after Mr. Fletcher's passing that a young widow named Sarah Cobb came to Hollowmere, taking the small cottage on Elderbrook Lane that had stood empty since its previous owner had moved to live with family nearer the coast. She arrived with little more than a single trunk and a boy of perhaps 7, quiet and watchful in the way children sometimes are when they have learned too early that the world can shift beneath them without warning. The village welcomed her gently, as it welcomed all newcomers, though Sarah herself remained careful and closed for the better part of that first autumn, answering greetings with polite brevity and hurrying home each evening before the lanes grew dark. It was Clara who first drew her out. In the unhurried way the bakery seemed always to manage such things. She noticed the boy, whose name was Thomas, lingering at the bakery window some mornings on his way to Miss Alcott's schoolroom, his eyes fixed on the rising dough with the same quiet fascination Edmund himself had once felt as a child watching his own father work. Clara began leaving a small heel of bread wrapped in paper on the windowsill some mornings, never remarking on it directly, until Thomas grew bold enough to knock at the door instead of simply watching through the glass. And from there, in the way such things happen in villages that know how to be patient, an easy friendship grew between the boy and the 2 silvered bakers who ran the shop on Lavender Lane. Sarah herself began to soften that winter, drawn in slowly through her son's growing comfort with the place, until she found herself, one particularly cold Thursday evening, seated by the bakery hearth alongside Mrs. Pembroke and Miss Alcott, a cup of tea warming her hands while Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor with the recipe book open before him, tracing the looping handwriting in its margins with his small finger. It was there, in that firelit room, that Sarah finally spoke of her husband, lost some years before to a fever that had swept through their previous town, and of the fear that had followed her ever since, that any place she called home might be taken from her just as suddenly. Clara, listening, said only that Hollowmere had a way of holding its people gently through exactly such fears, and that she herself had once believed her own home lost to her for 40 long years, only to find it waiting unchanged and warm whenever she finally allowed herself to return. Thomas grew up in the years that followed much as Edmund himself had, spending more afternoons than not in the warm hush of the bakery, learning the particular fold of the dough that had once been Clara's own invention, long before he was old enough to understand that the recipes he was learning carried nearly a century of village history folded into their careful measurements. Sarah, in time, took up mending for the village, her needle as steady and patient as Edmund's hands at the ovens, and it became known, eventually, that her small cottage on Elderbrook Lane and the bakery on Lavender Lane had grown as close as 2 households in Hollowmere ever grew, bound not by blood but by the same quiet grace that had always characterized the village's deepest friendships. It was Thomas, grown into a young man by then, tall and steady in a way that reminded the older villagers fondly of Edmund's own youth, who first suggested, one autumn evening by the hearth, that he might learn the whole of the bakery's craft properly, so that the ovens might never once go cold, whatever years lay ahead for the silvered brother and sister who had raised him nearly as much as his own mother had. Edmund, hearing this, felt something in his chest ease in much the same way it had eased the morning Clara's letter first arrived, the quiet relief of a promise finding its next patient keeper before the one keeping it now had even thought to ask. The morning Thomas carried the loaf across the bridge for the first time entirely on his own, Edmund watched from the bakery window rather than accompanying him, wanting the boy to learn the particular solitude of the ritual before it became, as it inevitably would, simply another comfortable habit folded into his days. Clara stood beside her brother at the glass, both of them silent, watching the young man's careful steps across the old stone bridge, the linen-wrapped loaf held with a gentleness neither of them had needed to teach him. When Thomas returned, his cheeks reddened by the cold morning air, he said only that he had understood, somewhere in the walking, why it mattered so much not to look back, that the not looking was itself a kind of trust, a way of believing the gift complete before you had any proof of it at all. Edmund found he had no better way of explaining it himself, and told the boy simply that he had understood exactly what mattered most. Sarah Cobb lived to see her son settled into the bakery's rhythm fully before her own final winter came gently upon her. Tended in her last weeks by Clara and Mrs. Pembroke in turns, the same unhurried care the village had always shown its own. She told Clara, near the end, that she had come to Hollowmere a frightened woman clutching a single trunk and a watchful boy, certain that nothing good could be trusted to last, and that the village had spent years quietly proving her wrong, one small kindness at a time, until she had finally, gratefully, allowed herself to believe in permanence again. Clara held her hand through those final days and told her that Hollowmere had done the very same for her once, many years before, and that this, she suspected, was simply what the village was for. And so the mornings continued, gentler now with younger hands folded into the old rhythm, the dough still rising in the blue hour before dawn, the oven still glowing gold against the darkness, the loaf still wrapped in soft linen and carried across the bridge to rest beneath the willow tree, though now it was sometimes Thomas's steady young hands that carried it, learning, as Edmund once had, the particular peace of walking away without looking back. Years continued to fold gently over Hollowmere after that, each one indistinguishable from the last in the way that peaceful years often are, marked only by the turning of the seasons and the small, steady accumulation of a village's ordinary kindnesses. The bakery passed, in time, from Edmund's hands to Thomas's, though Clara remained in the small room above the shop until her final winter, still adding notes to the recipe book's now well-worn second volume, still humming the same old wordless tune on quiet mornings that Mrs. Pembroke had once sworn belonged to her alone. Edmund lived to see his sister's return properly honored by the whole of the village's memory. The story of the loaf beneath the willow tree told now not as a mystery but as one of Hollowmere's oldest and gentlest legends, passed down through Thursday evening gatherings to each new generation who came to sit by that particular hearth. The bakery itself changed little through all these years, its window still fogging each morning with the warmth of the ovens inside, its copper bell still worn smooth, though now by generations of hands rather than merely 2 or 3. The chair by the hearth remained free for anyone who needed to sit a while without explaining why, just as it always had, and the recipe book upon its shelf grew thicker with the years, its second volume nearly filled now with the notes and additions of a family, and a village that had never stopped adding its own quiet history to those well-worn pages. Autumn returned once more, the mist gathering low and silver over the old apiary, the leaves along Elderbrook Lane turning slowly toward their deep and familiar gold, and on one such morning, in the blue hour before the church bells rang for the day, a young man with steady hands and flour still dusting his forearms could be seen crossing Hollowmere Bridge alone, a small linen-wrapped loaf carried carefully before him, its warmth still rising faintly into the cool morning air. He walked without hurry, the way the village itself had always moved, and set the loaf down gently beneath the willow tree exactly where it had rested every morning for the better part of a century, before turning and making his way back toward the bakery, its window already glowing gold against the lifting mist. Even now, if you were to find yourself walking along that same bridge in the soft gray hour before dawn, you might catch the scent of warm bread drifting faintly on the morning air, and you might see, resting beneath the old willow tree, a small loaf wrapped in linen, waiting quietly for whoever needs it most that day. You would not see who left it there, for those who carry it across the bridge each morning have long since learned, the way Edmund learned so many years before them, to walk away without looking back, trusting that some gifts become whole simply in the giving, and that Hollowmere, gentle and unhurried as it has always been, will carry the rest. The bells ring softly now across the sleeping village, calling the last lit windows toward darkness, and the mist rises slow and silver over the water, settling over the bridge and the willow tree and the small, warm loaf resting beneath it, as Hollowmere, as it always does, drifts gently, peacefully into sleep.